Well, I've been coming to Russia since I was 18 years old, and especially to St. Petersburg, which was still called Leningrad at the time when I first got there. And I've made several films there, and you cannot be there without hearing about the siege of Leningrad. The city was surrounded by the Germans in the Second World War, and out of the 3 million people in the city, 1 million people died of hunger. But also over the years I noticed that when it was talked about, it was very often connected with heroism. So people were giving medals, siege survivors. And at some point I got to hear from a woman who was in one of my films. She told me a completely different story. She told me how she was walking in the streets. It was minus 40 degrees outside, and minus 30. It was extremely cold, and she was trying to hide from the cold, and she ran into she hid it into a building, and she went into an apartment, and there was a family sitting around the table, and they were frozen and had died of hunger. And this image didn't, was such a contrast with what I'd seen before, with the celebrations and the medals and the heroism. So that's when I decided to investigate. I realized that authorities had created a myth about, also about the war, but also about the siege. They created a much, very heroic picture of how they had won the war, but a lot of things had happened, and also a lot of mistakes were made on the side of the Soviets, and this part nobody ever, was supposed not to be discussed again. And I think for the survivors of siege themselves, this more heroic version of what had happened also helped a lot of people, because it was so painful what they went through. It was, I think for most of them impossible to talk about it. So this myth that was created also maybe, in a way helped them in order to not have to talk about it, but still get recognition. In a way, of course, it was difficult for all of them to talk, and some people in the film still they couldn't really tell, couldn't answer some of the questions I had, but that's okay, because the film is really about how they deal with their own memories, how they about the siege. So if someone really cannot talk, that is fine, and other people really did want to talk, and yeah, it usually took a lot of time. I mean, a lot of course, trust. So I knew them, of course. I spent, it was not like I came into their living room for the first time and said, hey, let's talk about the siege. Very often, first they had to tell the stories they'd always been telling, the more heroic stories. And once they got through that, then they would start to tell, different stories. But it differed with different persons.